Web frameworks. So I want to give a high-level overview of web frameworks and the things that they do for you. So first, let's remember what we know so far about HTTP GET and POST. So we know that we have a browser here, and the web browser issues HTTP GET requests. So it'll say get and say /index.html. Send that to the server, the web server, which will then fetch that file from the file system. So if your web server, running Apache or Nginx, those are your common web servers programs. So those programs just sit there listening for these requests, and then will fetch that file from the file system and return it. Basically, that's what they do. So when you're building a web application, what you do is you replace, instead of using Apache or Nginx, mostly you just kind of replace those and replace them with a program. Your program, that's going to be your web app. And your web application, instead of just going to the file system and fetching index.html, is going to dynamically generate it. So it'll run a program that generates that file. The way it will do that almost always is there's also a database running maybe on the same machine or some other machine local to it. And this is, your database, so DB. And typically this is going to be, MySQL or Mongo if you're doing NoSQL. So there's other databases, Postgres and stuff. So it'll be a database that's running on some machine, and the web application will go to the database, fetch some data from that database. It will also go to the file system to maybe fetch some template files, etc. Put those together and return the value, right? So it builds the page by using some files and some stuff from the database, putting that together, returning it to the user. So that is the basic thing that all web frameworks do, right? So whether it's Ruby on Rails or Django or ASP.MVC, they all do that. They all do exactly the same thing at this level. Now the first thing, one of the other things they provide is, because they all have to go to the database, right? And you're writing your code here for the web application in some programming language. One of the things you need to do is you need to map the stuff from the database to your code, right? So for example, if let's go down here, and let's say I have a users table in the database. So there's a users table, and the users table will have, every user has a name and a picture, say photo of him, and maybe some other stuff, right? So you have that users table. So when you're building your web application, you want to fetch, a particular user's name and picture, etc. And you want to have that available in your code. So this is going to be, say Python or C#, etc. So you want to be able to access a particular user in your code. How do you do that? Well, you want to access that user in your code. How are you going to do that? You're going to have to, the old-fashioned way would be you would write some, say, SQL code if you're doing SQL, which goes to the database and then fetches the particular user from the database as, a big string or a big object, and then you take that big string object and you parse it out into a user object. So because the whole process of taking a database element and turning it into an object is so common, it's been pretty standardized, and all the frameworks will provide you with some sort of ORM. So that's an object relational mapping. So they'll provide some object. This is, say, a user object. So you might have a way to create a user object in, say, Python or C#, which corresponds to a particular user in the database here. So Bob and his picture here. So the ORM, or your relational mapping library for your web application framework, all it does is it takes a particular row from your database and maps it to an object in, remember this is an object in, say, Python or C#, whatever programming language you're using. So this is the object, and they just make that, they just make that mapping. And that mapping is super useful because then you can just, in Python, you can just say, user.name equals Alex, and it will just change it in the database. So you can say stuff like this. User, what I wanted to say is user.name is if you want to change the user's name from Bob to Alex, you can just write that line of code there or something similar to that, and the ORM code would just actually save that to the database, like I said, automatically. Or maybe you have to do user.save afterwards or something. But that's the idea. So, the idea of the ORM code is that you never have to write SQL code. So all web application frameworks, Django, Ruby on Rails, will provide you with something like this. They won't call it ORM. They'll call it different things. Like in Ruby on Rails, they call it the active record. And in Django, I think they're just called models. And a lot of it, like the Google App Engine, also calls it something like a model. A lot of them will call it a model or something similar to a model. So this is model from the MVC, the model view controller design pattern. Because in fact, that object is the model for your web app. So you'll have objects that are users, objects that are comments, posts, depending on your application. So the ORM is one of the main things that your web framework will provide. It'll be have different names depending on what framework you choose, but you will have some sort of object relational mapping to build your web application. Now, going back to the browser here. So far the browser has been issuing gets, and originally, going back in time, a get was only generated when the user clicked on a link. So the browser will show a page and have some text, whatever, and then there'll be some links. And when the user clicked on that one link, and only then will the browser issue a get. So sometimes in the late 90s, Microsoft introduced this idea of XHR, an XML HTTP request. So basically, they just said, okay, let's allow the browser to issue gets, but have those gets be generated by JavaScript. So the idea is you would get an HTML page. The browser would then get maybe will have to get some code, some program P written JavaScript from the server, and the server return that program back. And then at some point later, this JavaScript program starts to run, and then that JavaScript program issues another get, some other get. And the get would be maybe for some data. And originally this was XML. So the original idea was to fetch data encoded in XML. Nowadays, it's going to be data encoded in JSON. I mean, you can still do whatever you want. You can get data in any format. You can get images, HTML, etc. But typically, it will fetch most of the time JSON data. So, but the main thing is that the JavaScript issues the get, not the user. So why is that important? So this was used in this technique we call Ajax. And the way that works is, first the user downloads the page, right? So you have a whole page here. So this is some kind of Facebook thing. So you have, a column here with some stuffs on the right, and then here's some posts, etc. There's some stuff on the right column too. So you have a complicated page with a bunch of different areas. And the idea is that instead of every time refreshing the whole page, the JavaScript could say, okay, I need to refresh just this box here. And so I'm going to issue, the JavaScript is like, I'm going to issue a get to, refresh that. I'm going to issue a get for some data, and then the JavaScript itself gets the data back, not the whole page. So the page is not refreshed. The JavaScript takes that data, formats it nicely in HTML, and updates just this part of the page. So the user gets a much nicer experience, right? And this is what is used by a lot of websites nowadays. And then, so it was used initially just to update, maybe one little part or another little part. Over time, this led to the single page application way of doing things. Or SPA. So in an SPA application, when you start that, so this would be something like maybe Gmail. Think of Gmail. It does one get when you go to that page the first time. It just one get, and it gets app.html, and that is like a big get. It sets up the whole page, with the various columns and the various parts here. And then forevermore, and after that, all it's going to do is going to issue gets, but they're going to be XHR requests, right? So there's only one time at the beginning when you fetch the whole page, and forevermore, you only update parts of the page. So it's all done with JavaScript. Because it's all done with JavaScript, there's a lot of stuff that you need to keep track of in order to do this. So you will use, if you're going to do a single page application, you will use a JavaScript library such as, maybe Angular or React are two popular ones, with some React plus some packages. And there are other ones out there, Polymer, etc. So there's all these JavaScript libraries that are now popular that lets you do this single page application. So you just they handle all the nitty gritty of displaying and updating the various parts, and just make it a lot easier for you to write the JavaScript code and the HTML code to do all that. So those are single page applications. Typically, you would if you implement a single page application, you just do just one big get HTML, so you have only one HTML page here, and all these other XHR requests are going to be fairly easy. So your web, you still have to write a server, of course, and the server will go to the database, but these get requests here, because they're just for data, the web application on the server side is pretty simple. It just takes this get. You might say get/user/7. So basically give me user 7, and your web application only has to do is go to the database and find user number 7 and return that, say typically as a JSON object. So the code in the back end is really simple. All the complexity is moved to your JavaScript code. So that's basically just a big high-level overview. So the old-fashioned way of doing things is where you put all your code in the back end. So you generate your HTML pages, and they're complicated, and you leave all that generation to the back end. Nowadays, a lot of web applications use this SPA idea, where they use libraries such as Angular and React, and move a lot of the display logic to JavaScript and to the front end. Which one you choose depends on what you need, right? So single page applications are things like Gmail and Google Calendar, which are sort of more like applications. The more traditional thing is more useful for something like Facebook, that maybe is not as active, or a blog, certainly. Things it's not really an application, it's mostly static. So it's a decision you'll have to make at some point.